The first point I would like to make is that Spinoza cannot be using the term intuition in the way philosophers generally do. And in fact, what I'm going to argue is that Spinoza's understanding of the term intuition is much closer to the way mathematicians use it than philosophers. But I've taken some examples here from well-known contemporary philosophers, which I think Spinoza would regard as useful consolidations of error. Here's the way Sol Kripke appeals to intuition. Let me read it out. Some philosophers think that some things having intuitive content is very inconclusive evidence in favor of it. I think it is very heavy evidence in favor of anything myself. I really don't know, in a way, what more conclusive evidence one can have about anything, ultimately speaking. Now, on the strength of this appeal to intuition, Kripke goes on to say, people who think the notion of accidental property unintuitive have intuition reverse, I think. Now, this conclusion of Kripke's is something that Spinoza would reject out of hand. Think of Proposition 33 in Book 1, where he says that things could not be produced in any order or in any manner other than that in which they had been, in fact, produced. When Kripke is referring to accidental property here, I believe that he is referring to the distinction that Aristotle makes between essential and accidental properties. And for Spinoza, there can be no such distinction in the sense that all properties of any given thing are necessary. So how Spinoza, I think, would respond to this statement if Kripke were to say to him that he's looking at a dog and the color of the dog's coat is an accidental rather than an essential property of the dog, Spinoza would say he's actually confusing the perception of a dog with a confused universal, a concept of a dog, an abstraction. In the concept of a dog, the color can change, but the color of a given dog is what it is. It cannot be other than it actually is for Spinoza. But the point I'm trying to make here is that Kripke is arriving at this conclusion on the strength of an appeal to intuition, which Spinoza would reject out of hand. Okay, you see the same thing here in David Lewis, who says that one comes to philosophy already endowed with a stock of opinions. It is not the business of philosophy either to undermine or to justify these pre-existing opinions to any great extent, but only to try to discover ways of expanding them into an orderly system. So Lewis is explicit that what he thinks of as intuition is a matter of opinion. And we've just seen that for Spinoza, opinion is knowledge of the first kind. Knowledge of the first kind is the only source of falsity. So the point I want to make here at the outset is let's beware of assuming that when Spinoza is talking about intuition, he's using the word in the same way that other philosophers use it. And I think that there really is a difference becomes clear if you look elsewhere in Spinoza's writings to see the claims that he is making for what he calls intuitive knowledge. So here we have a few propositions from Book 5 of the Ethics and a few quotes from the Theological Political Treatise. Let me just go through them quickly. Proposition 32 of Book 5. Whatever we understand by the intuitive kind of knowledge, we take delight in, and our delight is accompanied by the idea of God as cause. On the basis of this proposition, Spinoza is going to identify intuitive knowledge with what he calls the intellectual love of God. For Spinoza, love is joy, an emotion of joy or pleasure, accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Love of God, then, is joy, accompanied by the idea of God as a cause. And this joy is intellectual. This is the delight that he's referring to here. It's because the intuitive kind of knowledge is a mental activity. Okay, it's the mind exercising its power of understanding, thereby passing, well, again, in Spinoza's language, Spinoza would say that it is passing from a lesser to a greater degree of perfection. So the claims then that he's going to make for intuitive knowledge are extremely strong. Okay, he says that from the intuitive kind of knowledge arises the highest possible mental acquiescence. This is acquiescence to our circumstances, to what happens to us, to ourselves. Okay, all of this, he claims, is a consequence of what he understands by intuitive knowledge. And he says that there is nothing in nature which is contrary to this intellectual love or intuitive knowledge, which can take it away. And he really does appear to mean nothing whatsoever. Not sickness, not old age, not death. From the theological political treatise, there are a few statements, excuse me, I messed that up. There are a few statements here which may actually come as a surprise to anybody who hasn't previously been exposed to this, because they reveal an unsuspected admiration of Spinoza for the figure of Christ. So let me read them. Inasmuch as God revealed himself to Christ, or to Christ's mind immediately, and not as to the prophets through words and symbols, we must needs suppose that Christ perceived truly what was revealed. In other words, he understood it. For a matter is understood when it is perceived simply by the mind without words or symbols. Okay, this is Spinoza's intuitive knowledge. Okay, truth which is revealed immediately without being filtered through words or symbols. And again, a man who can by pure intuition comprehend ideas which are neither contained in nor deducible from the foundations of our natural knowledge must necessarily possess a mind far superior to those of his fellow men, nor do I believe that any have been so endowed save Christ. Okay, so the distinction he's making here is between pure intuition on the one hand, and on the other, ideas which are contained in or which are deducible from the foundations of our natural knowledge, that is to say, knowledge of the second kind or reason. So here we have Spinoza praising Christ on the grounds of his extraordinary intellectual gifts. Only in Spinoza, I think, could you do this. Christ for Spinoza was an ethical teacher rather than a philosopher, but he believed that his own ethical teachings were fundamentally the same as those of Christ, but directed towards a different audience. rather than to the multitude or the vulgar population at large. Spinoza is addressing an intellectual audience. Okay, another thing before we actually try to parse Spinoza's definition is to notice that it concerns our knowledge of particular things or singular things, depending on the translation. This emphasis is really important in Spinoza. Okay, he says, so here's a few quotes from the short treatise where he says, for example, that only singular things are really existing things, that it is ignorance to conclude that God has no knowledge of particular and corruptible things, but only of universals. And he says that God is a cause of and provider for only particular things. Again, from Book 5, A Proposition, the more we understand particular things, the more do we understand God. And Proposition 37 of Book 2, which we saw 2 weeks ago, he says here that what is common to all things and is equally in the part and in the whole, common notions, what is common to all things does not constitute the essence of any singular thing. The way I read this is Spinoza is saying that through knowledge of the second kind, through reason, we can gain adequate knowledge of the properties that things have in common with each other, but not of the things which distinguish one thing from another, and these latter properties are needed to have knowledge of the essence of a singular thing. So here in Proposition 37, he is delimiting the scope of knowledge of the second kind in order to make way for knowledge of the third kind. I'll just quote one other passage from Book 5, where he shows by example how much the knowledge of singular things, which he has called intuitive, can accomplish, and how much more powerful it is than the universal knowledge of the second kind. For although I have shown generally in part 1 that all things depend on God, nevertheless, that demonstration still does not affect our mind as much as when this is inferred from the very essence of any singular thing, which we say depends on God. Okay, so knowledge of the third kind involves tracing a direct causal connection between God and a given singular thing. The example that he's actually referring to here, the singular thing that he has in mind, is the human mind itself. He's claiming that the mind can understand itself as being in God and following from the necessity of the divine nature through knowledge of the third kind. Okay, so all of this just to set the scene for what Spinoza could possibly mean by this definition. Okay, intuitive knowledge proceeds from an adequate idea of the formal essence of certain attributes of God to the adequate knowledge of the formal essence of things. This is the definition. Okay, apart from the definition, all he has given us to work with is a mathematical example. So what I want to do here is propose an interpretation of the definition and show how the interpretation is borne out by the type of mathematical example that he gives immediately afterwards. So when we talk about God being the cause of a singular thing, we have to go back and look at some of the propositions in Book One. The most pertinent ones, I think, are these two. Proposition 29, which says that nothing in the universe is contingent, but all things are conditioned to operate and exist in a particular manner by the necessity of the divine nature. Remember that Spinoza explains what he means by contingent in the scholium to this proposition 33, where he says that contingency is just a matter of a defect in our knowledge. Okay, the idea that something could be other than it is, or that it could fail to exist, okay, is something that arises in us through our lack of knowledge of the causal history that is responsible for the production of that thing. Remember that for Spinoza, anything that is not impossible must actually be the case. Anything that actually is the case is necessarily the case. There is no gap between what is possible and what is necessary. There is no room for contingency understood as the idea that something could fail to exist, something that actually exists could fail to exist, or could exist in a different way. This really is just another statement of Proposition 29. Things could not have been produced by God in any order or in any manner other than that in which they have been produced. Okay, in a word, everything that is necessarily the way it is and could not be otherwise. Okay, and it's what I believe Spinoza is saying in this definition is that it's possible to see directly, immediately, through intuitive knowledge, that certain states of affairs could not be other than they actually are. And it is this way of seeing things that leads him to make statements like, from the intuitive kind of knowledge arises the highest possible mental acquiescence. Once we see that things could not be other than they actually are, we stop arguing with reality. We acquiesce with reality. I could ramble on about this for a while, but I think the point has already been made, and if it's not clear, then it really is necessary to go back and look at Spinoza's propositions about determinism and necessitarianism in Book One. What I'll do now is just show how the type of mathematical example that Spinoza serves up to us as a complement to this definition can be seen to amplify this conception, okay? The ability to see truths as being necessarily true. So he appeals to a mathematical example. It's not a terribly interesting example. It's known as the rule of three. I've taken a different example to work with because simply because I can illustrate it with a picture. But let's just take a minute to appreciate the fact that for Spinoza, like the other 17th century rationalists, the mathematics really is the gold standard of truth. Okay, because mathematical reasoning is entirely a priori. It doesn't appeal to sense experience, to a posteriori evidence. So you see this, for instance, in the appendix to book one. The context here is he is uh, dismissing the teleology, the idea of final causes, or the idea that an event could be explained by appealing to the will of God. He says that such a doctrine might well have sufficed to conceal the truth from the human race for all eternity if mathematics had not furnished another standard of verity. So let's just work through this example and then see what this has to do with the distinction that I've made between truth and seeing something to be true and seeing something to be necessarily true. So here's a very simple example. Okay, it's a fact which you can verify with a calculator that this equation holds true. Okay, if you get out your calculator, you'll find that both sides evaluate to 225, and this verification, because it's just an appeal to authority, is an example of what Spinoza calls the first kind of knowledge. If you were to establish this by the second kind of knowledge, by reason, the first thing you would do would be to observe that, well, there's probably a pattern here. Okay, if this thing holds true for the integer 5, it's quite likely that it holds true for every positive integer n. Okay, that this more general statement here must actually be true. And this is something that's actually quite easy to prove by a standard technique called mathematical induction. Mathematical induction is a sort of semi-mechanical proof technique, and the first proof technique that most students of pure mathematics encounter in their studies. Clearly, if you can prove this result for every positive integer n, then you certainly have proved it in the case n equal to 5. So there is now no doubt about the truth of this proposition. Not only do you know it's true, but you've actually proved that it must be true. The only problem is that you still don't have any insight into why it is true. And that insight is what Spinoza would say is something that can only be supplied by the third kind of knowledge. Okay, so how to see this by the third kind of knowledge? Okay, we're looking to see this without appealing to any logical argument. Okay, by direct, immediate perception. Here on the left-hand side, you see that you have a quantity which is raised to the power of 2. Okay, that means that it can probably be interpreted as an area. Here on the right-hand side, you have cubes, and cubes are naturally interpreted as volumes. So the question is there a way of seeing that the area on the left-hand side is equal to the volume on the right-hand side? Here in this first row of figures, we've taken each of these volumes and represented them by a stack of tiles. And here we've taken each of the piles of each of the stacks and rearranged them in a way which is indicated by the color coding, so as to fill out a square whose side is 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, which is to say the quantity appearing in the brackets. So the square, when you raise this to the power of 2, just counts all of the individual squares that appear here. Okay, the little squares inside each of the tiles, which are the same squares that appear up here. So these two actually must be the same, and this is an insight derived by the third kind of knowledge without appealing to words or symbols. So you can do this with any mathematical fact, provided that you understand it well enough. Spinoza is using a mathematical example like this because everybody recognizes that the truths of mathematics are all necessary truths. You may remember that for Spinoza, all truths are necessary truths. Okay, but it's only in the case of mathematics and I guess logic that there is general agreement that the truths of this subject are necessary truths. But there's a gap between seeing something is true and something is necessarily true. And this gap for Spinoza is filled by the third kind of knowledge. So Spinoza is using the word intuition in the way that mathematicians use it. And they talk in these terms all the time. Okay, when one mathematician says of another's work that it is non-trivial, what he actually means is I can follow the proof, but I don't see intuitively why it is true. And the business of understanding mathematics is really a matter of over and over again coming to intuitive understanding of the things that have already been proved to be true. So I believe that Spinoza's claim here that we have access to this intuitive kind of knowledge is just a statement that we have the ability to see that certain truths or certain states of affairs could not possibly be other than they actually are. And it is this ability to see things that way that causes us to acquiesce in them. To sort of try to drive home the importance of this point, I'm drawing a distinction here between the, let's say, the worldview of somebody like Robert Sapolsky, who wrote a very convincing knockdown argument against free will. Some of you might be familiar with it, and Spinoza's view. Sapolsky is a strict determinist. So is Spinoza. But Spinoza is also a necessitarian. For Spinoza, things could not possibly be other than they are. And that's not the case for Sapolsky. Sapolsky imagines that things could actually be different. And for that reason, he has a sad sack, depressive view of life. Spinoza dismisses out of hand the possibility that things could be other than they are. So he is never arguing with reality. For Spinoza, all things follow from the necessity of the divine nature, and that is good news. So much of our time in the rest of the ethics is going to be to see how to test that claim against reality or our experience.